Today we're going to talk about cultivating self-love on our journey of recovering from dieting or disordered eating. And one of the reasons that I think this is a really important topic is for many of us, it can feel as though self-love is something that's for somebody else, that it's never going to be possible for us. And I think the way that we frame self-love and understand what self-love is might help shift some of that sort of resistance to the idea of it being something that might work for us. So I know that there has been points in my journey of healing where I'm like, I can't even accept myself. How am I ever going to love myself? And really getting stuck in this idea of self-love being something that's really fluffy and not something that is a skill to cultivate. So I think the idea that self-love is a skill to cultivate to help us to counteract that critical voice that comes up in our head, that really allows us to see it as something that we can grow over time, that there isn't a perfection about it. It isn't we're either love ourselves or we don't. Like there's not that all or nothing thinking when it's something that's a skill. So let's talk about what self-love actually is. So it really is a state of mind. It's also a daily practice. And self-love includes all of us, and that includes our body. So there's no part of us, no part of our experience that isn't welcomed into that self-love practice. I think that's a really important point to make, because self-love in this frame and looking at self-love in this way, it is a practice that really helps us tune into our needs and desires, not just at a cognitive level, but our emotional needs and desires, and our soma, like our body. What are our body's needs and desires? And really allowing ourselves this space for that quiet and contemplation and reflection to really tune into what those messages are that we might have been ignoring or not receiving in the past. I think another important part to acknowledge is that self-love really isn't met or achieved through the intellect. It's something that's whole-bodied. And I think an embodiment of compassion and kindness towards ourselves is really what we're talking about here. When we're talking about cultivating self-love, what we're really talking about is strengthening that compassionate observer voice in our head. So when we experience those critical thoughts that come up, which I know it happens for us when it comes to our bodies and often our food, because our culture breeds that in us. It's not something that we're really even choosing to do. It's so normalized to be critical of our body, to beat up on our body, to use our body as some kind of outlet for our feelings of insecurity, our fears about not fitting in, our fears about our own mortality, all of these things that, we really can't control. We can't control how we're perceived by others. We can't control how others value us or don't value us. We can't control the length of our life really to much of a degree. It's only about 20% of our health outcomes are actually attributed to lifestyle. So that's not a very big number. The compassionate observer allows us to really acknowledge when we're experiencing suffering or discontent with ourselves from outside influences. So when we're able to take that moment and acknowledge, okay, that critical voice is coming up right now, that critical voice that's dissecting my body or picking apart my food choices, it's coming up right now. I can observe it and see that it's coming from outside influences, because we're not naturally thinking these things about ourselves. These ideas about what our body should and shouldn't be, that's socially conditioned. That's not something that is inherent within us. That's not something that comes from within. So the more we cultivate the self-love practice of tuning into our own needs, of taking that space and feeling into it. I know for me, this past weekend, I actually was experiencing a tremendous amount of anxiety. I almost felt as though a panic attack was coming on, and I was just making breakfast for my kids. There was no reason for this panic attack to be coming. I had no idea why, but my body was feeling that. And so I dropped into that feeling. I let the feeling be there. And then I just started swaying back and forth. I ran on the spot a little bit. I jumped up and down. And I kept breathing and attuning, but my body, for whatever reason in that moment, really needed to move. And that, to me, that's a practice of cultivating self-love. In that moment, my critical voice would have been like, oh, Stacey, why the hell are you feeling anxious right now? There's absolutely nothing to be anxious about. And berating myself for having a feeling, that would have derailed my day most likely. Like, I would have felt like crap. But instead, I was able to acknowledge, okay, this is how I'm feeling right now. This is what my body's needing right now. How can I give it what it needs? And then doing that. So it's not the fluff. It's not that superficial kind of like, oh, I love myself, and affirmations and all that. It can be those things too. I think those things have their place, but we're really talking about something that runs much, much deeper than that. So what's really important is in those moments of struggle, when we're experiencing a situation, say we're, being confronted by somebody that's being really aggressive and we don't feel like we can stand up to them, and we start having all these critical thoughts of ourselves because we're like, you can't do that, and, like beating ourselves up. When we take that moment to take a breath and acknowledge, like, okay, I'm experiencing something challenging right now. This is how my mind is habitually reacting to it, and see it for what it is, and understand that the critical voice that's there, we don't have to listen to it. Like, it doesn't have to dictate our behavior, and it doesn't have to dictate our thoughts about ourselves. Like, when we're able to have that separation from that compassionate observer place and say, that's the criticism. I'm having a real hard time right now. That critical voice is really, really loud. But to be able to bring that self-compassionate observer in and see it without having to hook into it and buy into it, that's where the transformation can come. And when we're sitting down to a plate of food, or when we're making a choice about what we're making for dinner, or we're making a choice about what clothing to wear every day, or how we want to move our body, it's so important to pay attention to the critical voice that's coming up and make room for that compassionate observer. That's where the self-love comes from. So I hope that this was helpful. I really tried to synthesize some of the information that we were studying this week. So if there's any questions or comments or things you'd like to share, experiences that you've maybe had where you can relate to this, please do that in the comments below so that we can have some more conversation together about this. So thanks so much for being part of the group here. I'm really happy that we're coming together and trying to learn some of these tools and things together. Take good care.